and welcome to my video. Today I wanted to do a video on the disappearance of Lynette Dawson. On January 9th, 1982, in a small town in Sydney known as Bayview, 33-year-old mother of two, Lynette Dawson went missing. She had organised with her mum the previous night via phone to meet that day at North Ridge Baths with her two young daughters, but Lynette never turned up. Lynette was described as an absolutely beautiful woman inside and out. She would always do things for others, putting them first, and this also was shown through her choice of career, as once she finished school she decided to study nursing and actually worked as a nurse after she finished school. She was known to have such a sense of humour. She would always be the joker, playing pranks on people and just joking around. She didn't take life too seriously, Lynette. She was just there to have a good time. During high school is actually when Lynette met her soon-to-be husband, Chris Dawson. He was an NRL player at the time and she was this beautiful young woman, and I'm sure they caught each other's eyes and just fell in love so quickly. They were married by the age of 21, and just as a side note, this was Lynette's first serious relationship. It's important to remember that for later on in this case. She didn't really have anything to compare this relationship to, but it did seem like she was very, very happy within the relationship, especially at this time. Lynette actually struggled to fall pregnant, which I'm sure really took a toll on her, as she was such a loving person. I'm sure she wanted to just pour love into a human being of her own. But she did eventually fall pregnant twice. In fact, her and Chris had two beautiful children, Chanel and Sharon. And Lynette absolutely adored these children. She would do anything for them. One of their old babysitters actually was speaking about Lynette in an interview, and she said when she would go, she would just see how much care Lynette had for these children. She would do anything for them. Anyone who knew Lynette would say how much she loved her children. It was so obvious. Now I wanted to talk a little bit more about Chris Dawson, who was the husband of Lynette. He actually was a twin. He had a twin brother called Paul Dawson, and they did everything together. They both played NRL together. They actually modelled together. I think they modelled for a couple brands, but one you can still find online today, and I'll include a photo of it, is they modelled for Levi's. And they both, when their NRL careers were coming to an end in their early to mid-20s, went on to become high school teachers. Chris worked at Coroner High on the Northern Beaches, and Paul worked at French's Forest High, and they were both PE high school teachers. And weird side note, Paul actually taught my parents, because my parents went to Forest High at the time he was there. They didn't say much about him because, you know, of course I asked, loving crime myself, I asked what it was like to know of him, and they just said he was someone who appreciated attention. These twins were close. Anyone that knew them said they were inseparable. They did everything together. They were both attractive young men, and they got a lot of attention throughout their lives. Even when they became PE teachers, the students gave them a lot of attention, in particular the younger female students. They seemed to really like this attention, to the point where they were known to have sexual relations with the students. Both Chris and Paul and other teachers that worked at Coroner and Forest at the time were known to be having sexual relations with these underage students. And the thing is, which I find so crazy, is when I was doing this research, multiple people were saying that it was well known enough for it would have been impossible for other students and the principals of these schools not to at least know there were rumours that teachers were sleeping with students, but nothing was investigated. Not even now. I was listening to a podcast that was talking about the disappearance of Lynette Dawson, and on the podcast they were saying even to this point in time, New South Wales Education has made no contact with the people that have come forwards now saying that they were sexually assaulted by teachers during this time. I also just want to say how sick that is, that teachers were taking advantage of students. How could you do that to students? How to young children that are impressionable? And the fact that they got away with it. No one besides Chris from these schools has been charged with assaulting students. By 1981, Lynette and Chris's two daughters, Chanel and Sharon, would have been 3 and 1. Lynette and Chris would have been married for 10 years, and to the outside world, they seemed like a happy, loving couple. Behind closed doors, Chris had a really short temper. He would reprimand Lynette for even the smallest things that weren't done his way. One of the old babysitters of Chanel and Sharon actually said that she remembers seeing him once flick her really hard across the face with a tea towel because he'd gotten a cup out of the cupboard that wasn't fully clean. And it's just sad to think about, if that's true what she said, Chris was happy to do those things in front of her, then what was happening when there was no one to witness them together? What was he doing? In 1981, the same year, Chris and Lynette had a new babysitter because the old one actually quit after she saw him hit her across the face. And they moved their new babysitter into their house. Or I should say, Chris moved the new babysitter into their house. Her name was Joanne Curtis. And the reasons for her moving permanently into the house was escaping her violent father-in-law who would abuse her. This was true. She was escaping her violent father, but Lynette wasn't too keen on the idea of a 16-year-old that she didn't really know living at her house, and I don't blame her for feeling that way. She told Chris it was a nice thing to do though, letting her stay. What Chris failed to tell Lynette though was that he and this babysitter Joanne had been having sex for the last year. They were in a relationship and Lynette had no idea. Joanne was actually one of Chris's students from Coroner High. That's how they'd met. He'd actually given her driving lessons as well, which is how they got close. By this point, the marriage was going downhill. Lynette had bruises on her arms and stuff that her friends would see when she'd go and meet up with them, and they knew about these and they would ask why she had bruises on her arms, and she would say, oh, I did something to annoy Chris. It was really silly. I made him mad though. It was my fault. It's the fact that she thought it was normal and she thought it was okay to be treated like this. It's really sad. Joanne was living at the house while this was happening though, and the fact that she even now has not ever said anything about seeing Chris being abusive towards Lynette is crazy to me. How could you have missed that? How could you have missed everything when you were living there? A couple days before Christmas in 1981, Joanne and Chris planned and actually left for Queensland. The plan was that Chris was going to secure them a house and Joanne and Chris were going to work and they were just going to live happily ever after up the coast. According to Joanne, as they were driving just about at the Queensland border on Christmas Eve, she started becoming really anxious. She was thinking about the fact that her sisters were really far away and she was going to really miss them. And according to her, she told Chris that she couldn't go through with their plan to start a new life in Queensland and she wanted to go home. They both turned around and drove straight back home, and they spent Christmas night in the Coroner High School gym. sleeping on gym mattresses there. The next day, Chris drove Joanne back to her mother's house, where I'm sure there was a big uproar at the fact she'd just been missing for a couple of days. But Chris just went home. He went back to Lynette, and Lynette took him back in, and I'm sure she was hoping that it was just a one-off and it would never happen again, because she just really wanted this happy family. She really, really wanted to make this family work, and so she took him back in. I feel for Lynette. I think she was doing the best she could. Fast forward to 2 weeks when Lynette has organised with her mum to meet at Northbridge Baths with her 2 daughters, and actually with Chris too. Chris worked at Northbridge Baths at this point in time, as well as being a high school teacher, but Lynette didn't show up. Chris came to Lynn's mother at this point, and he told her that Lynn had said she needed a couple days to be alone. She'd gone off alone, and she needed those couple days to think about the marriage and just how she could fix it. The thing was, this didn't sound like Lynn at all. She left all her possessions at home, even her wedding rings, and she didn't contact anyone besides Chris. So Lynn's family was obviously very, very worried and suspicious when a couple days had gone and there was still no contact from Lynette. Lynette would have never left her children. She never would have up and left her children with no explanation, and her family knew this, and they knew from the get-go that something wasn't quite right. On top of this was the fact that Chris didn't seem that worried. He didn't report her missing for like 6 weeks from when she went missing. What sort of loving husband that cares about his wife doesn't report them missing for 6 weeks? He also seemed unfazed by the fact she'd disappeared. He kept telling the family that she was coming right back, and they had nothing to worry about, but time went and she wasn't coming back, and Chris was still sticking to his word. Chris never once went to any family members or anyone on the street or anything to ask whether they'd seen Lynette. He did nothing. On top of this was the fact that 2 days after Lynette went missing, Chris moved his high school student / babysitter permanently into the house. And not just into the house, he moved her into his room. Lynette's family for quite a few years wasn't actually aware of the fact that Chris had moved Joanne into the house straight after Lynette had gone missing, but I'm sure if they'd have known, it would have made them want to find her even more, and even more suspicious of Chris, because again, who does that? Police were contacted after a few days by Lynette's family, and to be honest, their actions or inactions are appalling. The police didn't interview one single person. They didn't interview the family. They didn't interview or go door knocking and ask anyone in the neighborhood if they'd seen her. They didn't interview Chris at all. There is no formal records from when she went missing of anything that Chris said. They didn't go into the house and look inside the house. There was just nothing. They seemed to be satisfied with the explanation that Lynette had gone and joined a religious cult, even though the family and friends knew Lynette would never leave her children and she would never join a religious cult. Lynette wasn't even that interested in religion. So the fact that she would do that was just so unlikely. Because of the inactions by police, there was nothing much the family could do, and because of the inactions by police, again, there was not that much media coverage of this. It was just another missing person, and people go missing in Australia all the time, so it really, to the media, wasn't a big deal because the police hadn't treated it as a big deal. In 1982, the case of Lynette just sort of fizzled out. Chris and Joanne moved a couple years later up to Queensland together. They did end up moving up there with his 2 children, and they got married and they had another child of their own, meaning that Chris had 3 kids and Joanne had 1 but was expected to raise 3 because she was raising Chanel and Sharon as well. Fast forward 8 years to 1990. Lynette had been missing for 8 years, and this case is looked into by a homicide squad. The case is looked into because Joanne actually comes to the police and she says she has some information on Chris that might help crack the case. Joanne had been living with Chris for the past 8 years and had recently gotten divorced from Chris and moved back to Sydney to live with her mother with her child. So she'd taken her child away from Chris and they were living with her mother now. Joanne by this point was 25. I just wanted to point that out because that's still so young. She said to the police that she wanted to talk a bit about her and Chris's relationship. She said that Chris was emotionally abusive and controlling of everything she would do. She was expected to raise his children as her own, and she was expected to do this from the age of 17. And a 17-year-old is a child themselves. She said she was expected to wait on Chris hand and foot and do everything he said. She said she had no social life when living in Queensland. She was not allowed to go to social clubs or creches or hang out with friends, join sports teams. She wasn't allowed to do any of that. Joanne said the only person she saw for years when she lived in Queensland, besides Chris and the kids, was Marilyn, who was Paul's wife. Paul had actually moved up to Queensland too at the same time Chris did with his wife and his kids, which again just highlights how inseparable they were. I think Joanne did a really good deed working up the courage to go and speak to police about Chris and about her experience living with him. I think that would have been so hard to do. I can't even imagine doing it. And it was the main reason, or the only reason really, that police looked into the case again, because there was new evidence. So 21 years after Lynette has gone missing and 13 years after Joanne initially spoke to police about Chris, they go to court and Joanne speaks about her experiences living in the house. The reason Joanne even went to court was because 2 coroners, one in 2001 and one in 2003, found that beyond reasonable doubt, Chris was the one that would have had to have murdered Lynette. So this is 2 professionals looking at all the evidence that was within the case, made the decision that Chris would have had to have been the one to murder Lynette. During this time in 2003, Chris wasn't charged though. He actually was let off, and at the time he was working as none other than a high school teacher in an all-girls Catholic school. So this guy that was now very much publicly known to have had sexual relationships with underage girls was working at an all-girls high school. I cannot explain how angry that makes me, that the education system would employ someone who is a pedophile. You'll have to please forgive me if any of this is wrong, but I tried to do a lot of research to really work out the facts. And basically what I think happened is in 2003 Chris was released, and it wasn't until 2018 when Chris was found in one of the houses he owned in Queensland and arrested on charges of murder of Lynette Dawson. He was in custody for a week until his family paid the bail of $1.5 million. This meant he was basically allowed to live his life freely until his court case began, which it did in June this year, 2019. Now, when I was doing my research, I found this section a bit confusing. And basically, what I've learnt is that in June this year, Chris, because the state has charged him with the murder of Lynette Dawson, that doesn't mean he's done the murder. It just means that's what the state is putting forwards. So basically, Chris was allowed to either come back to that statement saying he was guilty, so yes, he did murder Lynette, or no, he was not guilty. If he had pleaded guilty to the charge of murder of Lynette Dawson in July this year, then he would have been sentenced to jail by the prosecutor on that day. So the prosecutor who represents the state, which is New South Wales, would have said to him, okay, this is how long you're going to jail for the X charge. But Chris pleaded not guilty. That means that the matter goes to trial. So from July this year, they need to set a new date, which they haven't set yet, where his team of lawyers and the defense, and now the defense are the people that represent the state. So the state is the one that's charging Chris. So them and Chris's lawyers need to gather all their evidence and come to trial. Basically, sometime within the next year, there will be a date set where they come to trial and they argue their evidence, and a jury panel will be the ones to decide whether they're guilty or not. Now, I don't know if the people watching this know what a jury is, but basically in Australia for murder trials, the jury is a bunch of 12 to 15 normally people, random people. I could be part of a jury if I got picked, who watch the whole case, watch all the evidence, and then at the end decide whether the person is guilty or not. So that hasn't happened yet, but that will be happening in the next year, and I will make sure to include any information in the down bar if there's any changes to this case. I really hope, for the sake of Lynette and her family, that Chris is charged with murder. I'm sure that he will be charged with at least manslaughter, but yeah, I really do hope that he gets charged with murder. Chris Dawson is actually 71 now, so he's quite old. So even if he wasn't charged with murder, he would be spending the biggest proportion of his life in jail. Another thing I didn't talk about in this so far is the fact that Lynette's mum has actually passed on now. She never got to see this case being reopened. She never got to see Chris being charged with the murder of her daughter. But for the sake of the family and everyone who knew Lynette, I still hope he gets charged. I really do. And it's looking like he will, but you never know, time will tell. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it more than you could ever know. It means the world to me. It took me so long to make this video, to do all the research and stuff, and I still feel like I didn't fully do it justice, but I feel like I'm getting better slowly. I'm getting better from the Ivor Milat one that I did, so hopefully if I do another one it'll be even better again. But yeah, just thank you for watching, and I really hope you subscribe and give this video a like, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!